So I have now the very great pleasure of introducing Dr. Mike Ryan of the World Health Organization. So I have no doubt that you're no stranger to any of us, Mike. Mike played his key leadership role in coordinating and advising on our global response to the COVID pandemic. He's been at the forefront of managing acute risks to global health for nearly 25 years. And he also hails from County Sligo, so he's one of us. Good to see you again, Mike, and welcome this morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Very well. Mike, there's so many things that you've said, and in particular over the last 2 years, we've been hearing and seeing you more and more on our screens that are relevant and pertinent today. In particular, I think I said this to you, what struck me was that history will judge us on how we responded to the poorest communities in their darkest hour. But I think really relevant to this morning is your statement around how unless we can solve the problem of vaccine inequity, if we can't get that right, how can we get climate justice right? So many people say that COVID is quite different in terms of climate action. It was a significant disease, but the response, whilst hard, it was not straightforward, but it was a vaccine, stay at home, wear masks, a test, and the climate change is too complicated. We can't get the same reaction, and the impacts are too far away. But that's not the case anymore, Mike. I mentioned this morning some of those impacts that we're seeing in the news today. So can you talk to us a little bit about your point on vaccine inequity for a moment, and what have we learned through this global tragedy that we're not through yet? What has it taught us about our road to climate action and justice?
Maybe the journey is slightly similar, but COVID was a fantastic scientific revolution in the sense of bringing scientific knowledge to bear on a really complicated problem. We didn't understand the disease, we didn't understand the virus, we didn't understand how to build countermeasures. And in doing that, it was a great victory, but that was not enough. The knowledge and the knowing wasn't enough, and it still isn't enough to stop the virus, because it's the application of that knowledge that is the real answer. So having knowledge, having science is fantastic. It's a necessary prerequisite for success in any human endeavor. But being unable to apply that, or that knowledge not being accepted, is a major obstacle, or how that knowledge is shared in an equitable fashion. And I think I've heard people talk about climate change and say that many communities in developing countries are the ones being affected first and worst in the climate crisis. We've seen that in COVID too. But we've also seen, for me, the worst phenomenon, last and least. So these communities are affected first and worst, but they're the communities that receive help last and they receive the least help. So we have to look at that end of things. And in one ways, we should be all very proud of what was achieved, and especially the Irish community. I think community resilience in Ireland, community participation, the ways in which people sought knowledge, the activation of community solidarity, all of those things were wonderful to behold. I was very proud to be Irish witnessing that. Now, there were tensions and there were difficulties and there was distrust, but I think Ireland reacted extremely well, and many other countries did. But when we had these fantastic new innovations, we were not able to share them to those who needed them most. When we talked about frontline health workers, we talked about vulnerable people all around the world. We knew who was dying, we knew why, we knew the ones that were most likely to die. Yet, 2 years into the crisis, we still have not fixed that. And imagine right now the impact that COVID has had. 2 years of a crisis that in reality kills a small percentage of the people it affects. And look what it's done to the global economy. Look what it's done to politics. Look what it's done to economics. Look what it's done to our societies, the disruption. Now we face into maybe 50 years or 100 years of climate crisis and instability. Are we going to be able to withstand that slower onset, but deep emergency that's going to be created by climate change, and is being created right in front of our faces right now? So no, the experience was both heartening and was uplifting, and on the other hand, deeply tragic and deeply disturbing. And it's very hard for me at this point, before we even end the pandemic, to resolve those two emotions.
Yeah, and interesting, Mike. How do you think we overcome that feeling of doing it for the common good. Have you seen any examples where we've succeeded in that? Because that essentially is the answer to climate. If we could really get people to think about this small blue planet as one global community, have you seen any really good results from our evidence of that?
Well, not just in COVID, I mean, many other interventions I've done and been part of over the years. I think we get things wrong in a sense. I use an analogy of only a number of months ago, watching a documentary about the building of the Golden Gate Bridge in California. And I had never realized you have to build a suspension bridge from both sides. You can't actually build it from one side to the other. And I think a lot of our mental model of development and of science and of research and application is develop it globally, and then it trickles down into communities. And therefore, the scientists know best, the experts know best, governments know best. And unless and until that is turned around and you build from the community back up, you can generate the knowledge at global level. But unless that knowledge is integrated into people's daily lives, unless people see and understand and participate in the process of making those decisions, it will always be external. And that's why COVID generated a lot of solidarity at local level. People saw the local effects. People didn't set up food banks and visit people in long-term care facilities because they saw it on the television. They did it because their mother, their father, their friend, their neighbor was sick. They saw the direct impact, they saw the impact on their lives, and they saw that they could do something about it. They could protect themselves, they could protect others, they could bring meals to doctors and nurses working in hospitals, they could visit the elderly. They could take action, they had agency, they had ownership of part of the solution. And I think sometimes we in the scientific community, and it's not a bad thing, or it doesn't make us bad people, but it means that we have an arrogant interpretation of the wonderfulness of our knowledge, and how we can't understand why people just don't accept that. They can't understand why people just don't see the logic, and we get frustrated, and then we become even more directive, and we raise our voices louder, and we increase the level of alarm, right? And that shuts people down even more. So we end up creating a very dysfunctional dialogue. It's not even a dialogue, it becomes a monologue. And it becomes a shouting match. And I think we do a lot of research, and that research is very important. But again, we tend to focus on technological research, scientific research, research on drugs, research on, and you see the same in climate. The thing we really struggled in was understanding human reaction to a crisis, understanding how humans process knowledge and information about threat, about risk, about vulnerability, and how they absorb, who they listen to, where they listen to, who influences. How they process knowledge, and then how do they take action on that knowledge? Because if you give someone a catastrophic scenario, most people go to the pub because they think, well, there's nothing I can do about that, right? You know, and I think, you know, the more we in science and research continue to just raise alarms, cry wolf all the time, we just generate anxiety. We don't generate action. And the problem is we're an anxiety generating machine now, not an action generating machine. And we need to look at how we can switch that around. I mean, that's my experience in epidemics. It may not be exactly the same in climate, but that's my personal experience. And that's with communities all over the world.
Can I draw you back then to the Irish experience? You touched on it a minute ago, and you know, so many of us working close to a crisis like you're doing, or many of us working on the energy transition or in climate action, we get frustrated. Like you said, we start banging a drum because it's like, look, the evidence is so clear. Why aren't we getting change in behaviors? But we did see a glimmer of hope in Ireland in the response to COVID. We had one of the most successful uptakes of the vaccine globally, and we generally did behave cohesively as a society. What, from your inside and outside view, because you were looking at it from the Eagle view, but also being an Irish person looking at it, what do you think we got right? And what can we learn from that to try and apply it to climate?
Well, I think there's still, I mean, it's something I remark on all the time. Irish people like to talk, but they also like to listen. You'll see the survival of things like radio in Ireland, or it's an amazing phenomenon. I was home on holidays. I don't listen to radio here in Switzerland, but you go home to Ireland, you spend half your day with one ear on a radio listening to some talk show. So we do, I think, as an increasingly multi-ethnic society, we're good at generating discussion and dialogue. And I do think that's part of the success. I think the other part is that there's still a deep trust and respect in Ireland for people, doctors, for nurses, for scientists. There is that sense, you know, that people still respect knowledge. There's a great respect for the storyteller, for the performer, for anyone who can entertain, anyone who can provide input to communities. Has always been celebrated in Ireland. That idea of being welcome with knowledge, being welcome with any form of performance, entertainment. It doesn't matter. We you know, it's incredible how, you know, in Ireland things like poetry, things like that are still very prevalent. People still, you know, many of my friends will send me poems, you know, and I think, you know, it's so I do think there's that something about Irish society. We're lucky to still have that. We may be losing it, but there is that still that willingness, and there is still trust. And even though we complain about the government and we complain about politicians, and we're constantly doing that in every society, I still think people in Ireland feel connected to their representatives. They often know their representatives. They often know someone who knows that person. They're connected in some way, whether they're one side of the political divide or the other. So there's still a sense in Ireland that people can affect the debate, that you can walk up to your local politician and say something. So I do think there's a sense of, there's still people, Irish people still have that sense of agency, that sense of ability to act. And I do think that was part of that response. I also think a lot of excellent communicators in Ireland were out there talking all the time. There was transparency. And I think that's very, very important, that you have that transparency from government, transparency from leaders, that you admit when things are bad, you admit when things are wrong. You do not try to cover over, to gloss over, or to create and massage facts. That's a very dangerous thing to do, because that becomes marketing. And it's a very, very big difference, in my view, between communications and marketing. And it's really important that we understand that as we communicate with people, because this is not a once-off communication on climate. And we knew that in COVID. This wasn't going to be one ad campaign and it's all over. This is going to be a process of long-term communication. And it takes weeks, months, and years and decades to build trust, to build that listenership, to build people who trust your voice. And it takes minutes to lose it if you betray that trust. And trust is at the center of this. Who do I trust? Who do I listen to? You know?
Yeah, and I'm going to actually touch on the transparency piece in a minute, but interesting when you say about how you had to keep that trust up through COVID. What did you do at the World Health Organization? Because I know at home here, we had obviously the regular news briefings, and we were very aware in the background that kind of messaging was being tested, and conversations were being had with even representative groups of communities. So what was used in the World Health Organization to keep that, like you said, it's communications, it's two-way dialogue, it's listening as much as speaking, really, isn't it? I think I lost your mic there. Yeah.
No, I'm there. I think WHO is as deeply flawed an organization as any. We're all human beings, and we went on a major learning journey as well during this response. We had to scale up to levels that we've never had to do before. We had to deal with a crisis in 194 countries at one time. Normally our crises are Pakistan, there's a flood, or in Ukraine, there's a war. We know what we need to do in a certain geographic area. It can be overwhelming, but it has geographic limits, and you have a specific idea. We were trying to communicate with multiple cultures through multiple languages in a 24-hour news cycle, where people's perceptions in different countries of infectious disease, their trust in their own governments, the activity of the media and how it's controlled or not controlled was different in every single setting. So our messaging had to work across all of that. So it was a huge challenge to be able to do that credibly, to be able to do that authentically, and to maintain trust and continue communicating the whole time. The one thing we did learn in that, though, and we had been doing it before, but we had never applied it at this level, was not just communicating with governments, but for WHO, communicating directly with populations. but also communicating with groups in civil society. We had a world of work in which we had hundreds of thousands of people around the world working in unions, working in both in employer organizations, in union organizations, talking about work. We had a world of faith in which we had all the major faiths in the world and leaders in those faiths coming on webinars. We were doing webinars with youth organizations, with representation groups for older people, all kinds of different groups.
So a really joint up approach in terms
and just trying to keep the dialogue going, not worrying too much about preparing everything, not worrying about the perfect conference and the perfect pitch and the perfect presentation, but making ourselves available all the time to talk to anybody who wanted to talk about this. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to sustain. And it's really hard to fund, because when you go to the bosses and the donors and say, look, we want to have this massive dialogue with everybody. We want to keep talking to everyone. They say, well, what about the research? Where's the vaccine coming from? So you'll get the money for the vaccine, you get the money for the therapeutics, you get the funding for all of the technology, because, or for, I call it the yellow ribbon syndrome. You get money for the things that you can cut the yellow ribbon from, open a new institute, you know, build infrastructure.
The social license to operate, or the behaviors and adoption.
And we did the same. We opened new wings on hospitals, and we built field hospitals, and we put up tents, and we did all that. And that was fantastic because it was visible. But it's the invisible stuff. It's supporting the workforce in the front line, and not just supporting them with protective gear, but giving them psychological support for the work they're doing. And recognizing the impact that the epidemic was having, not only on people's health, physical health, but on people's mental health. And the isolation that people were feeling, and dealing with that, also dealing with things now like we're dealing with post-COVID condition, and recognizing that we have literally millions of people around the world struggling with the long-term effects of COVID. It's very easy to keep focusing on preventing COVID, but there's another group of individuals in the world who are really suffering. And it's very easy in a crisis and with the media cycle to get focused on one or two things. And everyone says, well, that's what the media and the world is interested in. We should focus on that. It's very hard then to step away and focus on the stuff that's not sexy, that's not in the news. And I think that's, for me, that's the learning I think that we did. We did a lot of social listening as well. We used artificial intelligence to look at social media feeds all over the world to see how communities were reacting to restrictions. How were they reacting to what was being talked about? Not what we thought people were reacting, or how we saw uptake of masks or purchases of masks, but actually looking at what people were talking about in social media. You know?
It was very personal too, wasn't it? I know I have a network of a group of 30 international people. We share a WhatsApp group, and we're normally talking about work-oriented things, which are quite climate-focused. Instead, we were talking about personal impact and who had been affected, our families, what was going on down the roads, and it was just a whole different approach, really, wasn't it?
Before I we also saw too, just one last point on this, we saw governments, however flawed in their responses, having an open and transparent approach, and over time that has worked. We also saw governments who really hurt their own response by leveraging, manipulating, being part of misinformation and the misinformation cycle. We talked about misinformation and disinformation. You know, there's a lot of, we can all misinterpret what's going on, and we can all have genuine doubts. I say this with anti-vaccination. Many people have genuine concerns and reasonable questions about vaccination. Who wants to put anything into your body without understanding what it does, what its side effects are, what its positive consequences are, what its negative consequences are? So doubt is not a disease. And it's the same on climate change. And we have to address people's doubts. And the idea that people, they're not anti, those people need to be engaged with. And the problem we have in much of our scientific communication is we lump people into the fors and the againsts. We have to work with the people who are against. Because the vast majority of people who are against don't have the right knowledge, don't fully understand, they need more information, they need better engagement, we need to get better. And then at the very edge of that, there's a very small group of individuals who actively manipulate, generate, and disseminate misinformation. And that's a different type of engagement we need with them. And the problem was that it wasn't only people in civil society engaging in those negative behaviors, that was happening too at state level.
I'd like to get back to the apathy piece and how to activate people to get over the sense of helplessness and paralysis. But first of all, I think we'll introduce our two other guests to join us at this stage, Mike. So I'd like to invite Mark Foley and Margie Donnelly to join us in the room. Two significant leaders in Ireland's climate action. And again, I'm sure they don't need any introduction, but in short, Mark is CEO of EirGrid, responsible for developing and operating our national electricity grid. And Margie is chairperson of the Climate Change Advisory Council. The council was established to assess and advise on how Ireland can achieve the transition to a low carbon, sustainable, climate resilient economy. So welcome to you both. Mark, I would just remind people as well that there are questions so we will try for the last 5 minutes of this first morning session to address some of those questions. So please do feel free to put them in, and our closing session later on as well will be dealing with a lot of some of the questions that are coming up. So if we don't get to them all, we'll get to them later. But Mark, I might just jump to you first. So we've heard from Mike about the urgency at hand, the challenges with regard to global health, but also, Mike, when we spoke before, we talked very much about how climate and health they're interwoven, and really they're all symptoms of the same thing. For you, Mark, our energy transition is a key component to our climate action in this country. And I was saying that when you launched your Shaping Our Electricity Future back in COP26, it was only a couple of days, I think, after the renewables target had been increased to 80% from 70%. And I think you thanked everyone for that nice surprise, but you also talked about the technology is here to do it. It's the hearts and minds that we have to win over now, so the societal transformation. So do you want to talk to us about what you meant by that? What's the journey you've been on with regard to that?
Yeah, I suppose, thank you, Margie. And it's great to be here, and well done in organising the conference. And it's lovely Mike is really inspiring. He did a superb job during the COVID crisis. Look, I don't tend to go on for long. Just really to cut to the chase, we have the legislation and the vision in place for one of the most advanced power systems in the world in 2030, courtesy of the government's low carbon and climate action bill. We have most of the policy framework in place. We have Margie's excellent Climate Change Advisory Council, which is leading out on in terms of sectoral budgets and providing law and order and governance around that. I believe firmly we have the technology to deliver all the bits of the jigsaw for a low carbon power system by 2030. What will trip us up are arguably two things. My first major concern is if we don't get the people of Ireland behind this. People become disconnected with the ambition of the energy transition. If they don't feel it's relevant to them, then it'll become a war of attrition over the next decade. And all the technology and all the capital that's available, there's more money than there are projects. We're not short of money. The issue is, can we get people engaged, and can people support the plan? And what we did with Shaping our Electricity Future was we really stepped back and we invested essentially a year and a half of some of the best brains in the company. Firstly, in terms of trying to explain in simple terms what 2030 might look like and what the roadmap could be, but also to go out and ask far and wide around the country, across civil society, young and old, politicians, business, you name it. And we invested in an inordinate amount of energy, time and resource to connect in to that whole ecosystem of the people of Ireland. And we basically said, look, how do you think we should go about this? We put out 4 options, and crucially, to Mike's point, we made all the data available. Everything we had, be it technical or otherwise, research, we put it all out there. And we went to work, I suppose, evangelizing, educating, but crucially listening. And we created a lot of space to hear back from people as to what their views were. And I think this exercise has served us really well, because we got some really good insight. And crucially, the thing I learned most, and I went into this thinking we had all the solutions, a lot of the solutions in technological terms, the loudest voice we heard was ordinary people saying they wanted to be part of this. And in particular, they wanted to be active, and they wanted for example, solar on homes to be a very, very important part of this. That was probably the biggest wake-up call, their desire to be active. So
and that turned into,
yeah, it turned out to be quite seminal, actually.
Yeah, just on that very point, Mark, I mean, you spoke about the microgen target within the national plans and really how when you started out in the Shaping Your Electricity Future journey, you didn't really see that being a big player in the overall plan, but by the end of it, you were convinced. So what was it that convinced the kind of decision makers nationally through those conversations with publics and with the citizens to take that on?
Hearing the voice from the young people in the youth assemblies, from we did citizens assembly type propositions. It was countrywide engagements in hotels. We heard back very, very strongly. If you want us to buy into this, make us part of this, reward us. I think the second thing we learned was, and it's very much part of our DNA, is when we want to build infrastructure in communities, we've got to go in there with an open mind as to what the solution is. And this is a radical change for an engineering organization like ourselves, where we would have prided ourselves, and rightly so, on technical excellence and an ability to come up with the best engineering solution. But the best engineering solution is not always the best social solution. It's not the best solution in terms of winning the hearts and minds of communities. So we've also radically changed our whole engagement proposition. We've made 3 decisions in the last year that we wouldn't have made 5 years ago. We put the converter station for the Celtic interconnector not in Ockraha because 1,000 people says we don't want it here. We put it in Ballyadam, and those people are supporting us. We put the North Connacht line underground. And the biggest piece of cable infrastructure in Irish transmission system history for the whole of the Dublin, Meath, Kildare region is going to be done underground. Why? Because people said we'll support you if you do that. And while it might not be the technically best solution, it's still doable. We've listened, and we're currently processing that through planning. So they've got to be active, and they got to be respected. And when we build a project, we need to give something back to the community. And that we are doing through a whole range of offerings when we discuss projects with them.
Thanks, Mark. Mary, I might turn to you. Nothing brings societal transformation more to our minds than recent headlines on energy security, the carbon budgets, the sectoral ceilings. It's not easy, but it's easier to set the overall target than it is to divvy it down into its component parts. Your work through the council has been hugely involved in advising and guiding on this. So can you tell us, really an awful lot of what needs to be done here is around changing what we value in society. As Mark and Mike said, we often have the technology solutions right there and available. How do we drive change in behaviours to actually deliver on those solutions? So can you tell us how the council takes that into account in terms of the behavioural research or what's available to them in how they're advising then how we achieve our climate action?
Thanks very much indeed, Margie, and thanks for the invitation today. And Mike, well done. I have made a note of a number of your comments there because they resonate so closely to the actions that we're taking at the moment. And I think one of the areas that I'd like to pick up on what you were saying in answer to your question, Margie, is that we have knowledge, and the question and the challenge that we're faced with now is applying that knowledge and applying it in a way that, as you say, Mike, moves from anxiety generation to action generation. And part of the challenge that we have, and I believe this is really our pinpoint challenge, is how do we get ownership of the solutions? And this, I think, Mark, is what you were saying too. People, I believe, in Ireland are concerned, they're aware, they're concerned, and they're at a point where they're ready to take action. But they're not 100% sure what it actually means. Sometimes there can be actions that they can take in a relatively easy way, and in other cases, the action is more challenging. And in conversations with people, they say, oh yes, I am very concerned about climate, I want to do my best, and I'm recycling much more, which is excellent. But of course, it doesn't go necessarily to the heart of the message that we have at the moment, which is that 67% of our emissions in Ireland come from fossil fuels. We import pretty much all of our fossil fuels. We might not be able to get them even when we're paying an outrageous price for them, and we have no control on that. And the consequences are that we as a society, and indeed also an economy, are vulnerable. So we have got to make the switch away from our dependence on fossil fuels as fast as possible, use our own resources, and I'll come back to what those are in a minute, because it's in our economic interest, it's in our societal interest, and it's also in our climate interest. And one of the concerns that we have in the council is, how do you get that message across to people in a way that they can absorb it, internalize it, and then act on it? And some of the actions need to be supported by government, and that's why we have our annual review, we have our reports, we have our letters to the government about the policies that they put in place. But some of it also relies on culture. As you were saying, Mike, there are strong cultural elements that flow through the Irish society. When we look at the concerns that people have about the cost of living, which is very real and going to be even more real, we talk a lot about electricity. And of course, electricity is hugely important, Mark, and I don't want to downgrade that in any way. It's very visible, but electricity represents 20% of the energy that we use. What about the other 80%? The other 80% is in transport and heat. And where is the conversation around those two areas? And what can we do in those two areas to help people so that they can become part of the solution? Now, if I take transport, it's very visible what we can do on transport. But again, where's the culture? To what extent are we going to be able to be successful in providing people with alternatives? If it's less than a kilometre, we should be taking the exercise. If there's public transport, we should be taking the public transport. Is there enough public transport? Make sure we have it there. And have we got the mindset to carpool or reduce those trips in the car, the private car, which is representing such a high share of our emissions? That's a cultural issue and ultimately becomes a societal one. That's where the community comes in. If the community buys into it and it becomes socially acceptable to carpool, for example, or it becomes, the norm to take the bus, as the case may be, or the train, then you can make the shift. But until you get that cultural change, it's very difficult to maximize the isolated incidents. And of course, the question of heat is very challenging. We have a large housing stock, more than 2 million. We have half of that on oil. To shift out of oil, it's not something you can do from today to tomorrow. What are the opportunities that exist? What are the possibilities that people can use? What's the cost that's going to apply for them coming down the track? It's not always possible for them to pay, even with the grants coming from SEAI. So when you're having the conversation with people, it's great to know what needs to be done. The real issue is, how can you do it? How can you make it happen in a practical sense that relates to the individuals that you're talking to? And I think here, one of the areas that we perhaps need to develop even more is the sense of community and cohesion across community and across society. And I think COVID was an area where we did have cohesion across community and across society. We're starting to lose it a little bit in our transition. The idea that parts of the country who are very rich in natural resources feel that they have done enough and they don't need to do any more, which would deprive other parts of the community of that power and energy or whatever, that's not cohesion. I mean, we're all in this together. We're all going to have to make the effort. We're all going to have to share the burden of doing this, because in the end of the day, we're all going to share the benefit. And I think that sense of societal cohesion is one of the areas that is causing a real concern to the council right now.
Thanks, Mary. Actually, a question on that, and really to all of you. This is something that's coming up from the people listening to you this morning. That what you said, Mike, makes complete and total sense around change, and what you've just added there, Mary, as well. But how can it be achieved with an economic system that's structured to reward, I suppose, financial wealth? And we've seen an awful lot of the change that's happening is happening iteratively, where I suppose where people are trying to do what they've always done in a better, more efficient, energy efficient, or climate friendly, environmentally friendly way, as opposed to maybe doing something completely different, like you're saying, Mary, just completely change the way and you go from A to B. So, like, we've seen examples with the donut economics. We've seen some examples in New Zealand, for example, measuring other things other than well-being. Measuring well-being other than GDP. Any views from you, Mary, on that? I mean, we have a short pathway to 2050 as it is. How can we start shifting the way in which we think success looks like, what good looks like for our society?
Well, I don't want to release the information in advance, but we've been working with the OECD on looking at transport and mobility from a well-being lens, which is kind of a different way of looking at it. Mm. And we'll be doing the launch of that in the beginning of October with the OECD. But what struck me out of their headline research was that we have, to some extent, in the transport space, gotten ourselves into a bottomless pit. You know, let me take the M50. We had huge congestion, people getting into Dublin, need to have mobility around the city and access to the city. We built the M50. It was 2 lanes. And very quickly, I think it was less than 10 years, it wasn't enough. So we built another lane around it. So by building the M50, we respond to a car driving society. Yeah. That encourages more cars in society. That generates congestion, even more congestion. And we respond to that by building more roads, which encourages even more car driving. So at a point in time, we have to stop and say, what are we doing? You know, what are we looking at here? Are we actually, in a structural sense, you know, reinforcing the existing habits, let's call them bad habits for the moment, instead of standing back and saying, you know, we have to structurally change the possibilities for people. You know, the 20-minute city, the possibility of being able to use, you know, different modes of transport in a commuter belt, the whole idea of taking cars off the roads so that people can get on the roads rather than cars, it's a very novel concept. But it's very hard to get public buy-in for that, even though when it happens, people generally are very pleased. So that just illustrates the kind of challenges that we have out there.
Thanks, Mary. Mike, if I could turn to you on that question around our value set as a community and the shift that's required there in terms of what we measure for success. I know you've spoken about this. I was looking through, as I was saying, there were lots of quotes I could have said. So any thoughts on that?
No, I just think we have to be also careful. I think it's called the chattering classes, that we speak to the people who want to be concerned about climate and all of this, because they have the money and they have the house and they're not in negative equity and they have 2 jobs and their kids are in nice schools, and you can recycle more and think about the electric car, and you can think about, but a lot of our society is just struggling to get through today, tomorrow. And these concerns are very distant. We deal as human beings with proximal threats. We're hunter-gatherers by nature. If it's not going to kill us today, you know what? There's a lot of stuff that's going to get us today. That's tomorrow. And it's pushed off because I have other concerns today. You know, everything. And if you're living in that reality where you can't make ends meet, you're struggling to put food on the table, and all of these things, and we spoke about those converging threats. Right now, the people being affected in society by, you know, we've got this confluence of conflict and climate and bad governance around the world, and it's just all parts of the world like the Sahel and Horn of Africa are becoming uninhabitable. We have an energy crisis been driven by conflict. We have floods in Pakistan been driven by climate, but we've got health system being destroyed by those floods, which is going to have knock-on effects for years. So this is all intertwined. But in the middle of all that going on, people are living their daily lives, and they're just trying to get by. And unless we find ways to make people's lives better, it's not about getting people to do stuff to make climate better. It's not about getting people to do stuff about some distal threat that may fry us all in 10 or 15 years' time. There's a lot of people today don't think they're going to be around in 10 or 15 years' time. There's a lot of people in Ireland today don't think they're going to be around tomorrow with the stress they're under. So this has got to come back to being about society, about lives, about livelihoods, around people having an opportunity to thrive, not just to survive. And unless we create a thriving society that can then be collectively concerned about distal threats, but unless we start to take away some of the proximal threats, the threats today to people's happiness and contentment, we can't just say we decided that the threat down the road in 50 years' time or 30 years' time is going to affect your life. So I think we have to, this is where the different sectors need to come together. Social equity, social justice, health justice, climate justice are entirely intertwined. The vast majority of people who died in the pandemic died not because of COVID. They died because of lack of access to healthcare. They died because of lack of management of underlying conditions, lack of management of hypertension, lack of management of diabetes. The obesity epidemic did as much to drive mortality in COVID than the virus itself. So unless we address those fundamental underlying issues in our society, I don't believe people may get on board. We'll have campaigns and we'll campaign for this and we'll campaign for that. But unless we understand, I think it's a personal view. This is not a corporate view. It's me just speaking here. And this is what I've learned in going into communities and saying we've got to control the Ebola epidemic in Congo in the middle of a civil war where people were being shot in the streets. You know, what do you mean? It's your Ebola. It's not our Ebola. You're concerned about Ebola because you're afraid it's going to spread to all the wealthy countries. That's not our concern here today. Our concern here today is putting food on the table and making sure our kids don't get shot on the way to school. That's my concern. If you can address that concern, I'll work with you on Ebola. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to address people's daily concerns and then bring climate and energy into that discussion. Maybe I'm way off base here because I'm not an expert at all, but I think that's where we have to start. You know?
If I may, I think, Mike, one of the things there that I really, really would buy into is that we're asking people to take action for this climate, which, as you quite rightly say, is somewhat remote. And I think the argument has been made that, yes, it's real and it's coming and we need to do something. So I think we're in that space. But I think where we have failed, and I include myself in this, is we haven't presented what the future can look like. You know, we're simply saying what you do today is wrong. But what we're not doing is saying, this is what the future can look like. Do you want that kind of future? And this is how we're going to get to that future. And I think that's a big part of trying to get people on board, to understand what it would look like and what it would feel like into the future. And I think in that context, there is a role for government, obviously, but there's a role also for the public sector. You know, the public sector, for example, in Ireland has gone through a series of energy efficiency measures. They've saved, what, 34%. Now, many of them are buildings that are heated with, say, modern technologies, heat pumps, they're insulated, all of that. You know, to what extent are we inviting the population in to come and feel and see and touch what the end results looks like, what it feels like, you know, in the depths of winter, when, you know, if you haven't done your insulation, you haven't upgraded your house is damp, even with the heat on. You go to a building that is insulated in the middle of winter, it's not damp. I mean, it's just that kind of feeling, touching experience that I think is really important, that we need to make available to people so that they can work for a positive solution rather than defensively against a negative solution.
Yeah. I mean, it even goes back to the research around, you know, that sense of belonging. You can't be what you can't see. It's really building scenarios and being able to visualize the future is so effective across all walks of life and challenges that we're facing. So applying it to climate makes absolute sense. I might go back in one moment to the transparency thing. Mark, I just wanted to bring in as a key player, obviously a key actor in our energy transition. There's a question in here about, is there a need for a national climate emergency team in the same way as NEFIT gathered during COVID? And we know that there is, you know, there's a national response now to energy security. We know there are climate dialogues. There are significant national activities happening. What's your sense, though, in terms of that question? Do we need it to be emergency mode, press the red button, and we're all on message in the same way as COVID was?
Maybe less emergency, more. I was incredibly impressed by the Irish government's response when COVID first landed. The first 6 months were extraordinarily impressive in terms of the quality of the communication, you know, getting and connecting with people in the country in an unprecedented pandemic situation. And I've always felt since then, if we could leverage that type of approach, that sense of collegiality, sense of common purpose, into a discussion about climate, which included education, to Mary's point, painting a simple picture of the future that my 91-year-old mother can understand, children can understand, that continuous campaign of information, of education, of reaching out, I think is absolutely essential. I'd be less inclined to put the emergency before it, because we're worn out from emergencies. We really are, and I think we've got to find a vehicle that's cross agency, very good on comms, and get that reach out. And I think we really need to do it. I remember talking to the Minister around about, when COVID's over, we need to do this. But of course, COVID had a very, very long tail on it, and we could never seem to, just before we could start to create space in public discourse, bloody Russians started with their egregious actions. But seriously, we just can't seem to find that gap. But when we can, I think we must do that, because education and engagement and listening is critical. And the government did a super job way back on COVID in the first 6 months. And so we know we can do it, and we need to get back there. But at the moment, it's a very crowded space between energy, Russia, and everything else to get any airtime.
Thanks, Mark. Mike, you're nodding in violent agreement there. Would you like to come in and make a comment?
No, I think that's true, that it's finding those gaps in people's consciousness where people can engage, because they're just being fed and people are just being bombarded all the time. And we're running out of, you know, energy to deal with crisis. It's just one crisis after another. People just can't cope with just being fed crisis all the time, because people want to have a life. They want to get on. I mean, there are people in Ireland, you know, who said, isn't it great, our weather is improving, you know, because it was hot this summer, you know. There's that feeling, you know, that people just want to have a better life. And I think we have to present a future to people that's about sustainable living. And sustainable living isn't just about energy and climate. It's about the built environment. You know, air pollution itself is not to do with climate per se, it's to do with emissions. We're talking about a very dangerous built environment in which the car is king. It's not about cars and energy. It's about safe environments for our children to walk to school. So I think we have to present a future that's more integrated, a future that presents a world in which there's a fairer attribution of resources, a fair sharing of resources. Do I want a climate neutral hospital or school? You know what? Give me a hospital or school that has enough staff and that can not have people sitting on trolleys for 3 days, or that are schools that don't have 28 or 38 kids in a school in one teacher with no special needs assistant. You know, so if we need to bring those things together. Justice and fairness needs to be central. And climate and social action and social equity and health, they need to come with that. I honestly think, because in other words, you may get that space mark in the next few months, and climate will get in there for a few months or a year, and then something else will come and displace your crisis, and you won't be able to sustain it. And I think we need to get the sectors together. and we need to look at how we inhabit the planet, not just how we inhabit the planet as a climate system, but as a biologic system, as a social system, and making that sustainable and making it such that we want our kids to live in a better world than we grew up in. And we certainly in Ireland live in a much fairer, more open society than our parents lived in. And we have a huge debt of gratitude to the generations that went before, that gave us a society that's more open, that's more fair, that's more transparent, where we can trust government, where everyone is more included. We're not perfect, but we're on that journey, and we've made huge progress as a society over the last 70 years. And with all of the frailties and with all of the injustices that went along that way, we've made progress. And I think that's what it needs to be about, making progress as a society. And the next challenge in making progress as a society is climate, it is energy, because that is going to be part of our progression to an even more fair, even more just, even more sustainable civilization. And I think that's the narrative, that's the story we need to tell, not a story of destruction and not a story of disaster, but a story of development, of progress, and of justice. And if we do that, I think people can buy into that for a longer period of time.
That's really powerful, Mike. Thanks. I mean, it really comes down to, and it's a book, so but it really struck me when I read it, is the future we choose, and it's the we choose. It will be fantastic for us to be able to rise above those individual, even I know those very vulnerable communities who are struggling day to day just to survive, as you said, try to come to some common understanding of what that future is that we're all working towards, because challenges are, I suppose, so much easier to overcome if you all know we're working to that ultimate goal. Thank you. I'm afraid we've come to close. I could continue all day listening to the three of you. We have many other wonderful speakers. This conversation has been really interesting and a really inspiring, motivating, let's get things done start to the day. It's my turn to say a very big thanks. I can say it's echoed throughout some of the comments coming through from people, and sorry we didn't get to all the questions from everybody, but a big thank you to you, all three of you, from the audience and from me as chair today. I really, really appreciate your input and for giving your time. So at this stage, thanks, Margie. At this stage, we are going to take a 10-minute break. Hopefully that's kick-started you off and kept the pulse rate going now for the rest of the day. Looking forward to hearing your questions and interaction from everybody as we move out throughout the day, but we're going to take a 10-minute break and restart at 10:10 when we are turning to our next panel, where they'll be setting a real national context and what action is underway and underpinning societal change in Ireland. So thank you.